apologize," Alistair said. His voice was calm, the way a man's voice is calm when he has never once been told no. He stood by the fireplace in his study, one hand resting on the mantel, watching the woman across from him, as if she were a problem that would soon solve itself. Evelina lifted her chin. "Then I shall ring for my trunks." For a moment, neither of them moved. Outside, London carried on without them, carriages rattling over cobblestones, a bell tolling somewhere in the distance. Inside that warm study, an engagement that had seemed unbreakable an hour earlier was cracking apart in silence. She was not a wealthy woman. She had no father to defend her name, no brother to challenge the Duke of Harrow to anything. She had come into this house with nothing but her character, and now the Duke was asking her to trade the one thing she still owned. She would not. "I would rather earn my bread with my own two hands," she said quietly, "than eat comfortably beside a man who chose silence over the truth." This is the story of a woman who was given an impossible choice, in a single cold study, on a single ordinary evening: swallow a lie to keep her comfort, or speak the truth and lose everything she had grown used to calling safe. It is a story about pride, about the kind of love that only survives honesty, and about a woman who discovered that dignity, once sold, can never truly be bought back. Stay until the end, because what Evelina builds after she walks out that door will surprise you more than anything that happens before it. 3 weeks earlier, Evelina had believed she was the luckiest woman in London. She had grown up the daughter of a modest schoolteacher in a small parish outside the city, a man who taught her French, mathematics, and the value of telling the truth, even when it cost her something. Her mother had died when Evelina was 19, quietly, of a fever that no doctor in the parish could name. Her father followed less than a year later, worn thin by grief he never spoke of, but carried in every line of his face. Evelina buried them both in the small churchyard behind the schoolhouse, and within a month, she had packed what little remained of her old life into a single trunk and gone looking for work. She took a position as a governess in a baron's household, teaching 2 young girls their letters and their scales, and it was there, quite by accident, that she met Alistair Ravenscroft, Duke of Harrow. He was not what she expected a duke to be. He had come to the baron's house on some matter of business, and while he waited in the drawing room, he had heard Evelina correcting one of her pupils' French pronunciation through the open door. Instead of ringing for a servant to fetch someone of proper rank to speak with, he had wandered into the schoolroom itself and asked, with genuine curiosity, rather than condescension, where she had learned such precise French. "My father taught me," she had said, startled to find a duke standing among the children's slates and copybooks. "Your father taught well," he had answered, and something in the way he said it, plain and sincere, without the practiced flattery she expected from men of his station, had stayed with her long after he left. He returned to the baron's house more often after that, always with some new excuse, a letter to deliver, a matter to discuss, and Evelina came to understand, slowly and then all at once, that the excuses were for her. He listened when she spoke. He asked her opinion on matters most men of his rank would never think to ask a woman without a fortune. He remembered small details she mentioned only once, a favorite book, a preference for lavender over rose, and returned to them weeks later as though they mattered. Within a year, he had asked for her hand, kneeling in the same gardens where they had first walked together properly, and Evelina had allowed herself to believe that perhaps the world was kinder than her losses had taught her to expect. Harrow House had become her home in the months that followed. It was a grand building of pale stone, with high windows that let in soft morning light. Fires kept burning in every room, even in late spring, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. She used to walk the long gallery upstairs and touch the frames of old paintings, imagining the day her own portrait might hang there beside his family's. She had never imagined such a life for herself, and there were mornings she woke in the soft, wide bed of her guest chamber and simply lay still, listening to the birds outside, disbelieving her own good fortune. That was before she found the ledger. It had happened almost by accident. She had gone looking for a household account book to settle a small dispute over a delivery of linens, and instead found a slim, leather-bound ledger tucked behind it on the shelf of the estate office, belonging not to the house steward, but to Julian, Alistair's cousin, who managed the charitable trust the family kept for widows and children of soldiers lost in the war. She had not meant to read it closely, but something in the handwriting caught her eye. Entries too careful, too evenly spaced, the way a man writes when he wishes a page to look ordinary, rather than to actually be ordinary. She sat down at the estate desk and read the ledger from its first page to its last, and by the time she finished, her hands had gone cold. £300 had gone out of the trust in small, quiet withdrawals over 4 months, each one recorded under a different excuse: repairs, transport, administrative costs. But Evelina had helped manage household accounts before, first for her father's small parish, and then for the Baron's estate. She knew what real expenses looked like, and these were not real expenses. There were no receipts to match the sums, no corresponding work completed anywhere on the grounds, no transport arranged that any coachman could recall providing. This was theft, careful and deliberate, from a fund meant to feed and clothe children who had already lost their fathers to war. She brought the ledger straight to Alistair. She remembered how her hands had trembled as she laid it on his desk, not from fear of being wrong, but from the certainty of being right, and from knowing exactly what such a discovery might cost his family's name. She had expected him to be as angry as she was. She had expected him to send for Julian immediately and demand an explanation, the way she believed the man she loved would always respond to wrongdoing. Instead, Alistair had gone very still. He turned the pages slowly, his brow drawing tighter with each one, and for a moment, Evelina believed she saw the man she loved rising to meet the moment exactly as she had hoped he would. Then his expression shifted, the openness in it closing over like a door pulled quietly shut. "You must be mistaken," he said, though his eyes had not left the numbers. "I am not mistaken, Alistair. Look at the dates. Look at the amounts. They match nothing real. I have checked the household records twice." He closed the ledger slowly, as though closing it might undo what was written inside. "Julian is my mother's favorite nephew. His own father died when he was a boy, and my mother raised him half the year as her own. If word of this reaches anyone outside this house, it will destroy what remains of my family's name, and it will destroy him besides." "It is not your family's name I am concerned with," Evelina said. "It is the widows who are owed that money. It is the children who will go without shoes because your cousin wanted new boots and better wine." That had been 3 days before the confrontation in his study. 3 days of Alistair avoiding the subject entirely, finding reasons to be occupied elsewhere whenever she raised it, of Evelina growing more certain with every hour that he already knew the truth of it and had chosen, deliberately, not to act. She watched him at dinner those 3 evenings, watched him laugh at his mother's small jokes and speak easily with Julian across the table, and felt something in her chest grow heavier each time, a slow, sinking recognition that the man she loved might not be entirely the man she had believed him to be. On the 3rd evening, she could bear the silence no longer, and asked him plainly to summon Julian and settle the matter once and for all. Now, standing in that same study, she understood exactly what he was asking of her. "I need you to let this go," he said. "I need you to say nothing more of it. If anyone asks, you were mistaken about the ledger. A misreading, a confusion of figures. You want me to lie. I want you to protect this family. Julian's family, perhaps. Not mine. I have none left to protect, only a conscience, and you are asking me to sell it as though it were a piece of furniture that could be traded away without cost." It was then that the door opened, and Rosamond, the Dowager Duchess, stepped inside without knocking, the way she always did, as though every room in the house belonged to her alone, and always would. She looked at Evelina the way she always had, with the faint, practiced disapproval of a woman assessing something she considered beneath her notice. A look Evelina had grown accustomed to over the past year, but had never learned to feel entirely comfortable beneath. "I heard raised voices," Rosamond said, though nothing had been raised at all, and Evelina understood that the Duchess had likely been listening at the door for some time before choosing this moment to enter. "Alistair, surely this can be settled without theatrics." "There are no theatrics, Your Grace," Evelina said, keeping her voice level. "Only a truth your family does not wish to hear." Rosamond's eyes narrowed. "You forget yourself. You came into this house with nothing. A governess my son was foolish enough to fall in love with. It would serve you to remember that a woman in your position does not accuse a duke's family and expect to remain welcome afterward." "I have not forgotten," Evelina said. "I remember it every day, Your Grace. It seems, however, that I am the only one in this room who still values what little I have, since it is all I possess honestly." "Honesty," Rosamond said, with a thin, humorless smile, "is a luxury for women who can afford to lose everything by insisting upon it." "You cannot. Then I shall have to discover, Your Grace, whether that is truly so," Evelina answered, "for I find I would rather test the truth of it than live comfortably beneath a lie I already know to be false." Alistair's jaw tightened at the exchange between them. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its softness entirely. "Apologize to my mother. Apologize for the accusation against Julian. Do this, and we forget this conversation ever happened. We can be married within the month, exactly as we planned, and none of this need ever come between us." Evelina looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of the man she had fallen in love with in that small schoolroom, the man who had once told her, walking through the gardens on a warm afternoon, that honesty mattered more to him than reputation, that he had grown weary of a world where everyone around him only ever told him what he wished to hear. She did not find that man now. In his place stood a duke, guarding his family's comfort, the way other men guarded treasure, and asking her to help him bury it. "And if I do not, then you have nowhere else to go, Evelina. You know that as well as I do. You have no family, no fortune, no name that would open a single respectable door to you if you left this house tonight." There it was, the reminder of exactly how little she owned, laid out plainly, meant to frighten her back into obedience, the way a firm hand steers a frightened horse. She felt something in her chest go cold and still, the way water goes still, just before it freezes entirely through. She thought of her father, of the small schoolhouse, of every lesson he had given her about the price of honesty, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the fear in her stomach did not outweigh the certainty settling beside it. "Apologize," Alistair said again, "or leave." Evelina lifted her chin. "Then I shall ring for my trunks." She turned before either of them could speak again, and walked from the study with her back straight and her hands steady, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could hear it in her own ears, a rushing sound like distant water. She climbed the stairs to the room that had been hers, and began, quietly and without tears, to pack. She took only what belonged to her, 2 dresses that were not gifts from him, her mother's small silver locket, the one keepsake she had carried through every loss since her parents' deaths, the few books her father had left her, their spines worn soft from years of handling. She left behind every piece of jewelry Alistair had given her, laid neatly on the dressing table in a small, deliberate row, because she would not carry reminders of a comfort she had chosen, with clear eyes, to refuse. When she came down the stairs an hour later, trunk in hand, Alistair was waiting in the entrance hall, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. For a moment, something like uncertainty crossed his face, as though even now he expected her to stop, to turn around, to set the trunk down and choose the easier path that still lay open before her. She did not stop. "You will come back," he said quietly, not quite a question, more a hope dressed as a certainty. "I would rather sleep on the street," Evelina answered, than sleep beside a man who chose comfort over what is right. She walked out through the great front doors of Harrow House, down the wide stone steps, into a London evening that had grown suddenly and completely unfamiliar. Behind her, the door closed with a soft, final sound, and Evelina stood alone on the pavement, with a single trunk and no home to return to, and felt, strangely, more herself than she had in weeks. She did not weep, though she had half expected herself to. She stood for a long moment on the pavement, looking up at the grand facade of Harrow House, lit gold against the darkening sky, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had just done. She had ended an engagement to a duke. She had walked away from every comfort she had grown accustomed to over the past year, from warm fires and full tables, and the particular, easy safety of never having to wonder where her next meal might come from. She had done it not in anger, though anger had certainly been present, but in the calm, considered certainty of a woman who understood that some things, once traded away, could never be bought back at any price. A carriage rattled past, its lamps swinging gently, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and fell silent. Evelina picked up her trunk, adjusted her grip, and began to walk, one careful step at a time, toward whatever came next. She did not look back at the house behind her. She had already said everything she needed to say to it. As she walked, the grand houses of the wealthy neighborhood gave way, street by street, to narrower buildings, dimmer lamps, and a different quality of noise entirely. Not the hushed murmur of servants moving through great halls, but the ordinary clatter of a city going about its evening business, unconcerned with dukes or ledgers or broken engagements. A boy selling the last of his evening papers called out headlines she did not register. A woman leaned from an upper window to call her children in from the street. None of them knew that the woman passing below, trunk in hand, had just given up more comfort than most of them would see in a lifetime, and Evelina found, oddly, that the anonymity steadied her rather than frightening her further. Here, at least, she was simply another woman walking home, and no one demanded she apologize for anything at all. The address a maid at Harrow House had once mentioned in passing, a respectable boarding house in Bloomsbury, kept by a widow who took in unmarried women of good character, became Evelina's only plan. She walked there that first night, trunk growing heavier with every street, until her arms ached and her feet blistered inside her thin boots. The city at night looked different than it had from the seat of a duke's carriage, louder and colder, and far less forgiving, and more than once she found herself glancing over her shoulder at the sound of footsteps that turned out to belong to no one in particular. She thought, as she walked, of the long walk she used to take each morning from her father's small cottage to the parish schoolhouse, a walk of nearly 2 miles that she had made in every kind of weather without once considering it a hardship, because it had simply been the shape of her ordinary life. She wondered now whether that early practice, that daily habit of putting one foot before the other, regardless of wind or rain, had quietly prepared her for exactly this moment, years later, on streets far from home, carrying a trunk instead of a satchel of books. Her father used to say that character was built less in grand, singular moments than in the small, repeated choices a person made when no one important was watching. She had not fully understood him at the time. She understood him rather better now, with her arms aching and her breath fogging in the evening air. The room she was given was nothing like what she had left behind. It held a narrow bed, a chipped washstand, a single window that let in more draught than light, and walls thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's cough through the plaster. The fire in the small grate was rationed by coal she would have to buy herself, and that first night she lay under a blanket that did not quite reach her shoulders, and allowed herself, finally, to remember. She remembered the first time Alistair had truly seen her, not as a governess to be tolerated, but as a woman worth knowing. It had been at a small gathering hosted by the Baron, and he had crossed an entire room to ask her opinion on a matter of French translation, ignoring 3 wealthier women who had been waiting for his attention all evening. She remembered how he had laughed, freely and without the careful control he wore in public, when she had corrected his pronunciation without apology, delighted rather than offended by her honesty. She remembered walking beside him in the gardens at Harrow House, how he had once stopped, quite suddenly, beneath an old oak tree, and told her that he had never met anyone who made honesty feel like a gift rather than a burden. She let herself return, that first night, to the afternoon of his proposal, though it ached to do so. He had asked her to walk with him beneath that same oak tree, and she remembered how nervous he had seemed, a man who commanded rooms full of lords and ministers with ease, fumbling instead over simple words meant only for her. He had knelt in the damp grass without any apparent concern for his fine trousers, and told her, plainly, and without the practiced eloquence she might have expected from a duke, that he did not know how to promise her the sort of grand romance found in novels, only that he intended to listen to her for the rest of his life, and to never grow tired of hearing what she truly thought. She had believed him entirely, and had said yes before he finished the second sentence, laughing through unexpected tears at her own eagerness. She wondered now, lying in the cold dark of her narrow room, whether that promise had been sincere in the moment he made it, or whether it had simply been the easiest thing to say to a woman he wished to marry. She did not doubt his sincerity. That was, perhaps, the hardest part of it all. She believed he had meant every word beneath that oak tree, and had still, when it mattered most, failed to keep it. That man, she thought, staring at the ceiling of her cold little room, had not entirely disappeared. But he had been buried beneath something else, something that valued family standing above the very honesty he had once praised in her, something that had perhaps always been there, waiting for the right pressure to reveal it. She thought of the ring she had left on the dressing table, a small, plain thing he had chosen himself, rather than accepting his mother's suggestion of a larger, grander stone. She thought of the warm fires, the soft beds, the certainty of a full stomach every evening, the easy comfort of never having to count coins before deciding whether she could afford supper. She was not foolish enough to pretend she did not miss it. Comfort has its own quiet pull, and she felt it now, in the ache of her back against the thin mattress, in the cold air slipping through the gap beneath the window. But she thought, too, of Alistair's voice saying, "Apologize or leave," as though her conscience were a small thing he could simply order away, like an unwanted dish at supper, and the ache in her back seemed a fair price by comparison. She had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly what kind of marriage she would be entering if she stayed and said the words he wanted. In the morning, she counted what money she had. It was not much, a little she had saved from her years as a governess, kept separate and private, even during her engagement, because her father had taught her never to depend entirely on another person's goodwill, however kind that person seemed. It would last her perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful. 6 weeks to find honest work, or she would be forced to write letters she did not want to write, asking favors from distant acquaintances who would ask, in return, why she had left a duke, and whose curiosity she was not yet prepared to satisfy. She would not write those letters unless there was truly no other choice left to her. The widow who kept the boarding house, a stern but not unkind woman named Mrs. Feld, found Evelina at breakfast the second morning, staring at a cup of weak tea she had made stretch as far as it would go, turning the cup slowly between her fingers rather than drinking it. "You've the look of a woman who has lost something large," Mrs. Feld said, not unkindly, setting a small plate of bread beside her without being asked. "I have lost a great many comforts," Evelina admitted, "but I do not believe I have lost myself." Mrs. Feld studied her for a long moment, the kind of long, assessing look that comes from years of taking in women with troubled pasts and learning to read the truth beneath their careful composure. That is more than most women can say when they arrive here. Most arrive having lost both. The words settled somewhere quiet in Evelina's chest, and she held onto them the way one holds onto a small light in a dark room, not enough to banish the darkness entirely, but enough to see one step ahead of where she stood. That evening, alone again in her narrow room, she allowed herself one final indulgence of doubt. She sat by the small window, watching the lamplighters move down the street below, their long poles rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost soothing, and wondered whether she had been too proud, too quick to sacrifice comfort for principle. It would have been so simple to say the words Alistair wanted. A single apology, spoken and forgotten by morning, and she would still be sleeping beneath warm blankets in Harrow House, still be planning a wedding rather than counting coins. But she knew, even as she considered it, that the apology would not have stayed small. It would have grown, quietly and steadily, into every future disagreement, every future silence she was expected to keep for the sake of family comfort. She would have learned, slowly and completely, to make herself smaller for a man who claimed to love her exactly as she was. She thought of what kind of wife such an apology would have made her, and what kind of mother she might have become to children raised to believe that truth was negotiable when it grew inconvenient. She had chosen hardship instead, and though the fear of what came next sat heavy in her stomach that night, pressing against her ribs like a stone, she did not, even once, wish she had chosen differently. There was a second night, some days later, that tested her resolve in a different way entirely. She woke past midnight to the sound of her neighbor's cough turning into something worse, a long, rattling fit that went on for several minutes before subsiding into ragged breathing. Evelina lay still in the dark, listening, and found herself thinking not of Alistair or of Harrow House, but of how thin the walls truly were between comfort and hardship, how a single illness, a single lost position, could turn even Mrs. Feld's modest boarding house into something far more desperate than it currently was for the woman on the other side of that wall. She rose the next morning and knocked gently on the neighbor's door, a young woman named Genevieve, who worked as a seamstress's assistant and had, it turned out, gone without proper food for 2 days in order to afford a tonic for her cough. Evelina had little enough to spare herself, but she shared what bread she had and sat with Genevieve for a quarter hour before her own morning's work called her away. It was a small thing, hardly worth remarking upon, and yet Evelina found herself thinking of it often in the weeks that followed. How easily kindness could still be given, even by a woman counting her own coins carefully, and how much that small exchange had done to steady her own sense of who she still was, apart from anything Alistair had once given her. The following days taught Evelina exactly how quickly a reputation could turn against a woman who had done nothing more than tell the truth. She began her search for respectable work the way she knew best, seeking a position as a governess or companion, presenting her old references from the Baron's household with as much confidence as she could manage, her dress brushed clean each morning, no matter how little sleep she had gotten the night before. The first house she visited, a well-kept townhouse belonging to a merchant's family, seemed promising until the lady of the house recognized her name partway through their conversation. "You were engaged to the Duke of Harrow," the woman said, eyes narrowing with sudden interest that was not kind, setting down her teacup with a small, deliberate click. "I heard you left him. Some scandal involving his cousin, was it not? My sister mentioned it only last week. There was no scandal on my part," Evelina answered carefully, keeping her voice steady, though her stomach had tightened. "I discovered a wrongdoing within the family, and would not stay silent about it." The woman's mouth thinned into something between disapproval and delight, the particular expression of someone who has just found new material for gossip and is already imagining how she will retell it. A governess who accuses noble families of theft? I think not, Miss Fairchild. I could not have my children exposed to such boldness. It sets a poor example. Evelina left that house with her cheeks burning, though she told herself, walking briskly down the street with her shawl drawn tight against the wind, that she had done nothing to be ashamed of. It was harder to believe by the 4th house, and harder still by the 6th, each refusal delivered with the same faint, knowing look, as though word of her had somehow traveled ahead of her through the city's drawing rooms, faster than she herself could walk. At the 4th house, A widowed baroness had at least the courtesy to be direct about her reasons, rather than dressing them in false regret. "You understand my position, Miss Fairchild," she said, not unkindly, but entirely without apology. "I have 3 daughters to see well married. I cannot risk their prospects on the reputation of a governess who has made herself the subject of drawing-room conversation, whatever the rights or wrongs of the matter may be. It is not a judgment on your character. It is simply arithmetic." "I understand the arithmetic perfectly, your ladyship," Evelina answered, keeping her voice even though something in her chest had gone tight and cold. "I only wish the sum came out differently for women who have done nothing more than tell the truth." The Baroness said nothing further, only inclined her head in a gesture that was almost, but not quite, an apology, and Evelina let herself out, without waiting to be shown to the door. She began to understand that it did not matter whether she had been right about Julian. What mattered, to the women who might have employed her, was that she had dared to leave a duke rather than keep quiet, and that made her dangerous. A woman who would not be silenced was, to many respectable households, a woman not worth the risk, regardless of how justified her silence-breaking had been. She thought, more than once during those difficult days, of a lesson her father had given her as a girl, sitting beside him at the small kitchen table while he corrected her sums by candlelight. He had told her that honesty was rarely rewarded quickly, and sometimes not rewarded at all in any way the world could measure, but that a person who abandoned it for comfort's sake generally found the comfort thinner than promised, and the loss of honesty far heavier than expected. She had not fully understood the lesson at the time. She understood it now, walking the cold streets of London, with her references clutched in one gloved hand, each closed door teaching her its truth a little more thoroughly than the last. By the end of the first week, her coins had grown noticeably lighter, and hunger had become a familiar, quiet companion, a dull ache she learned to work around rather than dwell upon. She ate less than she needed, and told herself it was only temporary, that something would turn in her favor soon. She patched the hem of her second dress herself, rather than pay a seamstress, sitting late by candlelight, with a needle borrowed from Mrs. Feld. She learned to walk past bakeries without letting her eyes linger too long on the bread in the window, though the smell of it, warm and rising through the morning air, tested her resolve more than once. There was one evening, cold and thin with rain, when she sat at the small writing desk in her room with a sheet of paper before her, a pen dipped and ready, and Alistair's name half formed in her mind. It would take only a few lines, an admission that she had been hasty, a request that he might reconsider, might forgive her supposed impertinence. She knew, with the particular certainty of the desperate, that he would take her back the moment such a letter reached him, that he might even be relieved to have the matter settled so easily. She sat there for nearly an hour, the ink drying twice on the untouched pen, the rain tapping steadily against the window, before she finally set it down and folded the blank paper away into the desk drawer. Whatever hunger gnawed at her stomach, it was not yet larger than her memory of his voice saying, "Apologize or leave," as though her convictions were his to command like a servant's schedule. She would not trade one kind of hunger for another, quieter kind that would never truly be satisfied. It was Mrs. Feld who, without being asked, mentioned one evening over a shared pot of tea that a bookseller 2 streets over was looking for someone to translate a small collection of French letters for a wealthy client interested in history. "You said, once you spoke French well," the widow said, almost carelessly, though Evelina suspected the carelessness was deliberate kindness, the sort that does not wish to be thanked too directly. Evelina went the next morning, her one good dress brushed as clean as she could manage, her hair pinned with more care than she had given it in days, and found the bookseller, a thin, spectacled man named Mr. Wexley, testing her with a single page of an old letter before he had even properly asked her name. She translated it carefully, choosing her words with the same precision her father had taught her at the small kitchen table of her childhood, and when she finished, Mr. Wexley studied the page for a long moment before looking up with something close to surprise. "This is good work," he said, sounding almost startled by his own conclusion. "Better than the last woman I hired for the task, and she charged twice what I intend to offer you for it." It was not much money. It would not fill her larder for long, nor buy her a warmer blanket for the coming winter. But it was honest work, earned entirely on her own merit, with no name attached but her own. And when she left his shop that afternoon, with a small advance pressed into her palm, and 3 more letters folded carefully into her bag for translating, Evelina felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, something she had not expected to feel so soon after everything she had lost. It felt, unmistakably, like hope, small and fragile, but entirely her own. That night, walking back to Mrs. Feld's house with the folded letters tucked safely inside her bag, Evelina allowed herself to notice the city around her properly, for the first time since her arrival. She had spent her first week in Bloomsbury moving through the streets with her head down, focused only on the next door she might knock upon, the next refusal she might have to bear. Now, with 3 letters waiting to be translated, and a small advance warming her pocket, she looked up. London in the early evening had a particular kind of beauty she had never noticed from the seat of Alistair's carriage. Lamplighters moved from post to post, with practiced efficiency. A flower seller called out the last of her stock at a reduced price, and Evelina, feeling almost reckless, purchased a small bundle of violets for a few pence, tucking them into a chipped cup on her windowsill that evening, rather than saving the coins for bread. It was a small extravagance, the kind she would once have thought nothing of, and now considered carefully, but she did not regret it. A woman who had chosen dignity over comfort, she reasoned, was entitled to a little beauty along the way. She thought, too, of her father, and of how proud he might have been to see her sitting at Mr. Wexley's counter, translating careful sentences from one language into another, earning her bread through the very skill he had spent so many patient evenings teaching her. He had never had much to leave her beyond that knowledge, but she understood now, more fully than she ever had while he lived, that it had been the greater inheritance all along, worth more than any dowry a wealthier father might have provided. Land could be lost, fortunes could be spent, but no one could take from her the words themselves, once she had learned to hold them. Not every door closed against her, though it often felt that way in her lowest moments. There was a particular afternoon, near the end of that difficult first week, when a widowed shopkeeper named Frederick, who ran a small stationer's near Mrs. Feld's house, overheard her quietly inquiring after any work at all, however humble, and offered her a few hours each week helping to balance his accounts, a task he confessed he had always managed poorly himself. He asked her nothing of dukes or scandals. He asked only whether she could add a column of figures correctly and write a clear hand, and when she proved she could do both, he paid her fairly and never once mentioned her past. It was a small kindness, but Evelina came to treasure it precisely because it was ordinary. Frederick did not see a fallen fiancée or a woman who had dared to accuse a duke's family. He saw a capable woman in need of honest work and offered it plainly, the way any decent employer might. She began to understand, slowly, that the city which had seemed so uniformly harsh in her first days contained more of these small, unremarkable kindnesses than she had first believed, scattered among the closed doors, like coins dropped and forgotten in the street, waiting for someone willing to look down and notice them. The weeks that followed asked more of Evelina than she had ever known she possessed, and slowly, without any single dramatic turn, she began to answer that demand, one small task at a time. Word of her translation work spread in small, quiet ways, the way honest work often does among people who value it. Mr. Wexley recommended her to a colleague who needed French correspondence handled for his business dealings with a house in Lyon. That colleague mentioned her name to a widow who wished her daughters to learn piano, having heard, almost in passing, that the same young woman who translated letters also played beautifully, a skill Evelina had nearly forgotten she possessed until she was asked, quite suddenly, to prove it. She began teaching 2 afternoons a week, seated at a modest pianoforte in a merchant's parlor, guiding small, clumsy fingers through simple scales, while the girl's mother sat nearby with her needlework, listening with quiet approval that grew warmer with each passing lesson. The elder of the two girls, a shy child of 9 named Ophelia, took a particular liking to Evelina, often lingering after her lesson to ask questions about the pieces of music rather than simply the notes themselves, and Evelina found herself explaining, with real pleasure, how a certain melody could carry sadness or joy depending on how gently or firmly it was played. It reminded her of teaching French to the Baron's daughters in her earlier life, and she realized, with some surprise, that she had missed the particular satisfaction of watching a young mind take hold of something new. One afternoon, Ophelia asked, with the blunt curiosity only a child possesses, why Evelina no longer wore the fine dresses the girl had once glimpsed in an old-fashioned plate belonging to her mother, one that happened to feature a woman remarkably similar in description to a duke's intended bride. Evelina considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words the way her father had once taught her to choose them, with truth, but also with kindness. I found that some dresses, however fine, are not worth what a person must agree to in order to keep wearing them, she said. I would rather wear plain wool, honestly, than fine silk dishonestly, Ophelia. It is not always an easy choice, but it is, I think, always the right one. Ophelia considered this with the particular seriousness of a child turning over a new idea, and said nothing more on the matter, though Evelina noticed, in the weeks that followed, that the girl seemed to watch her with a kind of quiet admiration she had not shown before, as though she had glimpsed something in her music teacher worth more than any fine dress could offer. It was tiring work, layered atop the translation she did most mornings and evenings, her hands often stained faintly with ink by the time she lay down each night. But Evelina found, to her own surprise, that she did not resent it. There was a particular satisfaction in earning every coin herself, in knowing that nothing she owned had been given to her out of pity or obligation or the quiet expectation of gratitude. She moved to a slightly larger room in Mrs. Feld's house, one with a proper fireplace and a window that let in real morning light, rather than mere grey daylight. It was still humble by Harrow House standards, the furniture plain and the rug threadbare in places, but it was hers, paid for with her own hands, and that made it feel larger than any room she had occupied before, larger even than the grand guest chamber she had once slept in as Alistair's intended bride. Meanwhile, across the city, Alistair sat in the familiar comfort of his club, surrounded by men who spoke of horses and politics, and rarely, if ever, of the woman who had walked out of his house weeks earlier. He told himself, more than once, swirling brandy he barely tasted, that Evelina would return. She had nowhere else to go, he reasoned. No family, no fortune, no name to shield her from the harshness of the city. Surely pride alone could not sustain a woman through true hardship, not for long. He did not yet know how wrong he was. "You look troubled, Harrow," Theodore, an old friend from his university days, remarked one evening over cards, studying Alistair's uncharacteristically distracted play. "Still no word from Miss Fairchild. She will come to her senses," Alistair said, more to himself than to Theodore, laying down a card without much thought to the game. "She has always been sensible. She will see reason before the month is out. Sensible women do not usually walk out on dukes," Theodore observed dryly, gathering the trick with a small shake of his head, "unless they have very good reason to do so. I have known you a long time, Alistair. You do not usually let a matter rest so easily when someone matters to you." Alistair said nothing to that, though the comment settled somewhere uncomfortable in his mind, and did not leave easily, following him back to Harrow House that night, and lingering long after he had retired to his empty bedchamber. His mother, for her part, offered little comfort in those weeks, though not for lack of concern. Rosamond had never been a woman to speak plainly of feeling, and so her worry expressed itself instead as a growing sharpness toward the household staff, a restlessness that sent her pacing the long gallery upstairs at odd hours. And, on one particular evening, A question posed so carefully, it took Alistair a moment to recognize it as an apology of sorts. "Do you suppose," Rosamond said, not quite meeting his eyes over the dinner table, "that I was too harsh with the girl? I have wondered, once or twice, whether my manner toward her made an already difficult situation harder to bear." "You were not kind to her, Mother," Alistair said, more bluntly than he might once have allowed himself to speak to her. "Neither was I. I have had a great deal of time to consider which of our failures weighed more heavily on her decision to leave, and I confess, I no longer believe it matters which of us failed her worse. We both did." Rosamond said nothing further on the matter that evening, but she did not raise her usual objections when, some days later, Alistair mentioned that Evelina had been right about the ledger all along, and that he intended to find her. It was, in its own quiet way, as close to an apology as his mother had ever offered anyone in his memory. There was an afternoon, some 3 weeks into her new life, when Evelina found herself walking past a familiar milliner's shop, one she and Alistair had visited together during a happier season. When he had insisted on buying her a hat she had only glanced at with mild admiration, delighted by the small, startled pleasure on her face when he presented it to her afterward. She stopped outside the window now, studying the display without truly seeing it, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to remember the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hand at her back as they walked, the particular way he used to look at her, as though she were the only interesting thing in a crowded room. She missed him. She would not pretend otherwise, not even to herself, not in the privacy of her own thoughts where honesty cost her nothing. The ache of his absence had not faded, simply because she had proven she could survive without him. But survival and longing, she was learning, could exist together, without one cancelling out the other. She could miss the man she had loved, and still refuse, entirely and without regret, to become someone smaller for his comfort. She turned away from the shop window and continued down the street, back toward Mr. Wexley's shop, where a fresh set of letters waited for her careful translation, and where no one asked her to apologize for anything at all. There was a particular evening that week, more tense than most, when Evelina sat at her small desk with her coin purse open before her, counting and recounting the same small stack of shillings as though a different result might appear on the third attempt. Her rent at Mrs. Feld's house was due within 2 days, and her translation earnings, though steady, had not quite yet caught up with the sum required. She sat with the numbers a long while, weighing whether to approach Mr. Wexley for an advance against work not yet completed, a request that sat uneasily with her, since she had promised herself, upon leaving Harrow House, that she would never again depend on anyone's goodwill beyond what she had honestly earned. In the end, she resolved it herself, taking on an additional evening of piano instruction for a neighboring family who had heard, through Ophelia's mother, of her skill, and completing 2 translations in a single long night by candlelight, rather than the usual 2 days she allowed herself. It cost her a night's proper sleep, and left her eyes tired and stinging by morning, but she paid her rent on the appointed day, in full, without asking anyone for a single shilling beyond what she had earned. It was a small victory, invisible to anyone but herself, and she treasured it all the more for that. By the end of that week, she had earned enough, entirely through her own labor, to secure her room for another full month, with a small amount left over that she tucked away, not out of fear, but out of the quiet, growing confidence of a woman who was beginning to trust her own capability in a way she never quite had before, even in her happiest days at Harrow House. She sat that evening by her window, watching the lamplighters move down the street exactly as they had that first lonely night, and found that the sight no longer filled her with dread. It filled her, instead, with something close to peace, and something even closer to pride. There were quieter moments in those weeks too, moments that did not announce themselves as turning points, but shaped her all the same. She began to know her neighbors at Mrs. Feld's house, a seamstress named Beatrice, who worked long hours bent over fine embroidery and never once complained of it, and an older woman, once a lady's companion, who had lost her position when her employer died, and had rebuilt her life twice already by the time Evelina arrived. In the evenings, the women sometimes gathered in the small shared parlor downstairs, mending clothes or reading aloud by candlelight. And Evelina found in their company something she had not expected to find so soon after losing everything she believed she needed. She found, in short, that she was not alone in having survived a hardship not of her own making, and that survival itself could be a quiet, companionable thing rather than a lonely battle fought behind a closed door. Beatrice, in particular, became something like a friend, teasing Evelina gently about her careful, precise manner of speech, the schoolteacher's daughter showing through even in casual conversation, and Evelina found herself laughing more easily in that plain little parlor than she had in the grand drawing rooms of Harrow House, where every laugh had to be measured against propriety. "You speak, Miss Fairchild," Beatrice said one evening, biting off a thread with her teeth in a manner Evelina suspected would have scandalized Rosamond entirely, as though every sentence must be inspected for accuracy before you allow yourself to say it. "It is no wonder a duke fell in love with you. You likely never once told him an untidy lie in the whole course of your courtship." "I did not," Evelina admitted, smiling despite herself. "Though I confess, I did not always tell him the whole of my thoughts either. Not out of dishonesty, but because a governess learns early that not every opinion is welcome in every room." "And now?" Beatrice asked, glancing up from her needlework. "Now I find I have very little left to lose by speaking plainly," Evelina said, "and I have discovered, rather to my own surprise, that I prefer it this way." She thought sometimes, late at night, of what her life might have looked like had she simply apologized as Alistair asked. She would have been married by now, mistress of a great house, wanting for nothing material. But she would not have known Beatrice's easy friendship, or the particular satisfaction of a coin earned through her own two hands, or the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she could survive whatever came, relying on no one's mercy but her own effort. She was not certain, weighing the two lives against each other in the dark, that the grander one would have made her happier at all. It was nearly 6 weeks after Evelina's departure when the walls Alistair had built around his certainty finally began to crack, slowly at first, and then all at once. She had not written, she had not sent word through any mutual acquaintance, had not appeared, tearful and repentant, at his door, as he had quietly, almost unconsciously, expected. The silence unsettled him more with each passing week, though he told no one, not even his mother, how often his thoughts returned to the sound of the front door closing behind her, or how empty the long gallery upstairs had begun to feel without the sound of her footsteps somewhere in the house. The truth arrived, in the end, not through confession but through paperwork, as such truths often do. The estate's new clerk, a careful young man named Nathaniel, hired to review the household accounts for the coming quarter, brought a discrepancy to Alistair's attention one morning, apologetic and uncertain, standing in the study doorway as though he feared overstepping some invisible boundary. "Your Grace, I do not wish to cause trouble, but these figures from the charitable trust do not align with the actual disbursements recorded by the trust's solicitor. There are gaps here, 4 months of them, that I cannot properly account for, no matter how I arrange the ledger." "Show me," Alistair said, his voice steadier than he felt. Nathaniel laid the papers across the desk with careful, precise movements, the movements of a man who suspected he was delivering unwelcome news to a powerful employer and wished to give him no further cause for displeasure. "I noticed it first while reconciling the quarterly totals. I assumed at first I had simply miscounted and checked the figures 3 times before I felt confident enough to bring them to you at all." "You were right to bring them to me," Alistair said. "Regardless of what you find here, Nathaniel, I would always rather know the truth of my own accounts than remain comfortably ignorant of them. Remember that, in your work for this house, for as long as you remain in it." Alistair felt something cold settle in his stomach, even before he took the papers from Nathaniel's hands. He knew, before he had read a single line, what he was about to find, and the knowing itself felt like a slow, sickening drop. The dates matched, the amounts matched, almost exactly, the very figures Evelina had laid before him weeks earlier, the ones he had dismissed with barely a glance because he had not wanted to see them, had not wanted the discomfort of choosing between his cousin and the truth. £300, drawn quietly from a fund meant for widows and orphaned children, disguised beneath vague and unconvincing labels: repairs, transport, administrative costs. The same three excuses, repeated with almost careless regularity, across 4 months of entries. He sat for a long while in his study, the same room where he had once demanded an apology from the one person who had told him the truth, and felt the full weight of what he had done settle over him like a stone dropped from a great height. He thought of Evelina's steady hands laying the ledger before him, of her certain voice, of how easily he might have simply believed her from the start, and how much smaller a cost that belief would have carried compared to what his refusal had ultimately cost him now. He sent for Julian that same afternoon. His cousin arrived with his usual easy charm, though it faltered the moment he saw the ledger open on Alistair's desk, the same ledger Evelina had once carried to him, with trembling but certain hands. "I can explain," Julian began, attempting a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Then explain," Alistair said, his voice quieter and far more dangerous than shouting would have been. "Explain to me why money, meant for widows of soldiers, has been paying for your tailoring bills and your gambling debts, Julian. I have the figures here before me. I have no patience left for anything but the truth." Julian's explanations, when they came, were thin and unconvincing, excuses about temporary borrowing and intentions to repay before anyone noticed, none of which softened the hard, cold fact laid bare in the ledger. Alistair listened to almost none of it, his attention drifting instead to a memory of Evelina standing in this very room, laying the truth before him with steady hands, and himself asking her to apologize for it, as though she were the one who had done something wrong. "You will leave London," Alistair said finally, cutting through Julian's stammering justifications. "You will repay every shilling, however long it takes you, and you will not set foot in this house again. And Julian, do not imagine, even for a moment, that I intend to protect you from the consequences of what you have done. I did that once already, and it cost me something I am not certain I can get back." "The scandal," Julian began, his voice rising slightly with genuine alarm. "Think what people will say, Alistair. Think what it will do to Mother, to the family name, if word gets out that a Ravenscroft stole from war widows." "I have thought of little else these past hours," Alistair answered, "and I have concluded that I would rather bear that shame honestly than continue bearing the shame of having hidden it. There is a difference, Julian, though I did not understand it myself until very recently. One kind of shame passes, the other kind settles into a man and changes who he is, slowly, without his ever quite noticing." "Damn the scandal," Alistair said, and meant it more fully than he had ever meant anything in his life. "I have spent weeks protecting a name that was never worth protecting at your expense, and at the expense of the one person who told me the truth, when it would have been far easier for her to say nothing at all. I will not make that mistake again, Julian, whatever it costs this family in whispers and gossip." Julian left Harrow House within the hour, his belongings hastily packed by a footman who avoided his eye, his easy charm entirely gone, replaced by something sullen and resentful that Alistair found he could not bring himself to care about. Rosamond, informed of the truth that same evening, sat in stunned silence for a long while before finally admitting, in a voice smaller than Alistair had ever heard from her, that she had suspected something of the sort for weeks, and had chosen, out of her own fondness for Julian, not to look too closely. It was, perhaps, the first time in Alistair's memory that his mother had confessed to a fault of her own, without first being cornered into it, and he found, watching her, that he understood a little better where his own instinct to protect family comfort, above all else, had first been planted. Alistair remained in his study long after his cousin had departed, staring at the ledger that had cost him everything he had once claimed to value most. He thought of Evelina's voice, steady, even as he threatened her security. "I would rather sleep on the street than sleep beside a coward." He had believed, at the time, that she was speaking from anger, from wounded pride, from the particular stubbornness he had sometimes teased her for possessing. He understood now, with painful clarity, that she had simply been telling him, plainly and honestly, exactly who he was in that moment, and he had been too proud himself to hear it. He thought, too, of a smaller moment he had barely registered at the time, an evening early in their courtship, before the engagement, when Evelina had gently corrected a false rumor circulating about a mutual acquaintance, a woman neither of them knew well, simply because she could not bear to let an untruth stand uncorrected, even at some social cost to herself. He had found it charming then, a pleasant eccentricity in an otherwise agreeable woman. He understood now that it had never been an eccentricity at all. It had been the whole of her character, consistent and unwavering, visible to him from the very beginning, if only he had been paying proper attention, rather than simply enjoying her company. He had chosen his family's comfort over the truth. He had chosen his own pride over the woman who loved him enough to risk everything rather than lie for him, who had walked out into an uncertain city with nothing but a single trunk, rather than betray her own conscience for his convenience. And in doing so, he had proven, beyond any doubt, that she had been entirely right to walk away from him. He thought back over the weeks since her departure, weeks he had spent largely at his club, or in this very study, waiting with a patience he now understood had never been patience at all, only stubbornness, dressed in more comfortable clothing. He had told himself a dozen small lies to make his own waiting bearable, that she would tire of hardship within a fortnight, that her principles, however admirable, could not truly withstand hunger and cold, that she would eventually see reason, by which he had meant only that she would eventually agree with him. Every one of those small lies had been, he now understood, a way of avoiding the larger, harder truth, that he had wronged her plainly and completely, and that no amount of waiting on his part would undo it. Only action would, only the truth, spoken and acted upon without further delay, however late it came. He rose from his desk that evening with a single purpose fixed clearly in his mind, more clearly than he had felt about anything in weeks. He would find her. He would bring her the truth, laid bare exactly as she had once laid it before him, and he would beg, if it came to that, for the chance to become the man she had once believed him to be. Finding Evelina proved far harder than Alistair had expected, and the difficulty of it forced him to confront, again and again, exactly how little he had truly known of her life outside the walls of Harrow House. She had left no address behind her, no note, nothing to indicate where a woman with almost no money might have gone in a city as vast and indifferent as London. He began with the obvious places, the households of old family friends who might have offered her shelter, and found nothing but polite confusion, none of them having heard from her since the engagement's quiet, scandalous end, several offering him sympathetic looks that made his jaw tighten with something close to shame. He spent 2 days in growing frustration, riding from one corner of the city to another, his usual composure slipping further with each dead end, his valet remarking privately to the housekeeper that his Grace had not slept properly in nearly a week. He thought, more than once, of the 6 weeks she had survived without a single word to him, and felt something close to shame at how easily he had assumed her survival impossible, how readily he had believed poverty would simply break her spirit and send her running back to him. There was a false lead in the middle of that second day that briefly raised and then dashed his hopes entirely. A tradesman's wife, mentioned in passing by an acquaintance, was said to have hired a governess, matching Evelina's description some weeks earlier. Alistair rode across the city with a speed that startled his own coachman, only to find, upon arrival, a governess of similar height and colouring, but an entirely different name, a woman who looked at him with alarm as he stammered an apology and departed as quickly as he had come. He sat afterward in his carriage for a long while, staring out at nothing, and understood, with fresh and painful clarity, exactly how thoroughly he had lost track of the woman he claimed to love, and how little right he had to expect finding her again would be simple. It was, in the end, a small stroke of fortune that led him to her. A footman at Harrow House recalled, almost as an afterthought while helping Alistair search through old correspondence, that Evelina had once mentioned a respectable boarding house in Bloomsbury, kept by a widow, spoken of by one of the housemaids during idle conversation months earlier, back when such details had seemed entirely unimportant. It was a thin thread, but it was the only one Alistair had, and he followed it without hesitation, calling for his horse before the footman had even finished speaking. He rode to Bloomsbury that same afternoon, and after asking at 3 separate houses, describing Evelina's appearance to increasingly confused shopkeepers, he finally found Mrs. Feld's establishment. A modest but tidy building on a quiet street lined with plane trees, just beginning to show their summer leaves. Mrs. Feld herself answered his knock, studying him with the particular suspicion widows reserve for well-dressed men who arrive unannounced, asking after young women living under their roof. "I am looking for Evelina Fairchild," Alistair said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest with both hands, an oddly humble gesture for a duke. "I have reason to believe she resides here. And who might you be, that I should tell you anything at all?" "Alistair Ravenscroft, Duke of Harrow." Something flickered across Mrs. Feld's face, recognition mixed with clear disapproval, her eyes narrowing further. The Duke, who let her walk out into the street with nothing but a single trunk, and told her she had nowhere else to go. "Yes," Alistair admitted, and found, to his own surprise, that he did not try to soften the truth of it, or offer some excuse for himself. "That Duke, exactly. I have come to admit as much to her, if she will allow me the chance to do so." Mrs. Feld studied him a moment longer, her expression unreadable, weighing something in her mind that Alistair could only guess at, before stepping back to let him into the narrow hallway. "She is not the same woman who arrived here 6 weeks ago, Your Grace. I would not expect tears and open arms, if that is what has brought you all this way across the city." "I do not expect anything," Alistair said quietly, and meant it. "I have come only to tell her the truth, and to hope it might matter to her, even now, whatever else she decides." "See that you mean that," Mrs. Feld said, her voice hardening slightly. "I have watched a great many women come through my door, with their hearts broken by men who spoke prettily and meant little by it. If you have come only to smooth your own conscience, Your Grace, you would do better to turn around now and spare her the disturbance." "I have not come to smooth my conscience," Alistair said. "My conscience, Mrs. Feld, has been considerably disturbed for 6 weeks, and I do not expect a single conversation to settle it. I have come because she deserves to hear the truth from me directly, and because I owe her considerably more than a single visit could repay, whatever she decides to do with what I tell her." Something in his answer seemed to satisfy the widow, for she said nothing further, only gave a short nod and turned to climb the narrow staircase. Somewhere upstairs, a door opened and closed, and Alistair heard, faintly, the low murmur of Mrs. Feld's voice, and a softer reply he could not quite make out. He clasped his hands behind his back, the way he had been trained to stand since boyhood, and then, feeling the posture suddenly foolish and stiff, let them fall to his sides instead. He was shown to a small parlour to wait while Mrs. Feld went to fetch Evelina, and in those minutes alone, surrounded by furniture far plainer than anything in Harrow House, a single worn armchair, and a small table bearing a vase of modest flowers, Alistair found himself thinking, with unexpected clarity, of every moment he had failed her. The dismissal of the ledger, the demand for an apology, the threat, thinly veiled, that she had nowhere else to go, delivered as though it were simply a practical observation rather than a cruelty. He had believed, in his pride, that her dependence on him gave him a kind of power over her choices, a leverage he could use whenever it suited him. He understood now that he had never had any power at all. only the illusion of it, built on the mistaken belief that a woman without money was a woman without will, without the strength to build something of her own, from nothing but her own two hands and her own stubborn conscience. He noticed, sitting there, the small details of the room he might once have dismissed without a thought. A shelf of well-worn books, borrowed rather than owned, arranged with obvious care. A single dried violet, pressed flat inside the pages of one, forgotten there like a small private treasure. A neat stack of paper beside the window, covered in careful French script, the work she had built her new life upon. None of it spoke of desperation. All of it spoke of a woman, quietly, deliberately making a home for herself out of very little, and doing it well. He thought, with a fresh and unwelcome ache, of how much of her life he had never truly seen, even during their engagement. Not the woman who mended her own hems by candlelight, or counted coins with careful precision, or found genuine pleasure in a well-turned sentence of translated French. He had loved an idea of her, he realized, polished and comfortable within the walls of Harrow House. He was only now, sitting in this narrow parlor, beginning to understand the fuller woman beneath that idea, and finding her, if anything, far more remarkable than the version he had first fallen in love with. He heard footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, composed, nothing like the desperate rush he had half expected, half hoped for, if he was honest with himself. He rose from his chair, his heart suddenly loud in his own ears, and turned toward the parlor door just as it opened. Evelina stood in the doorway, and for a long moment, Alistair could not speak at all. In the days before his arrival, though he did not yet know it, Evelina had continued her quiet, steady life, exactly as though nothing at all had changed. She had taught her piano lessons that same morning, had delivered a finished translation to Mr. Wexley the previous afternoon, had eaten a simple supper with Beatrice, and spoken of nothing more dramatic than the price of coal. She had not spent her weeks in Bloomsbury waiting for a duke to appear at her door, with apologies in hand. She had spent them building a life she was, to her own quiet surprise, rather proud of, brick by careful brick, and it was that life, more than any lingering hope of his return, that had carried her through. When Mrs. Feld had come to fetch her from her room, mentioning only that a gentleman waited below, Evelina had not needed to ask his name. Something in the widow's careful, measured tone told her exactly who had come, and she had taken a moment, standing alone before her small looking-glass, not to compose a performance of coldness or forgiveness, but simply to remind herself of everything she had learned about her own strength since the last time she had faced him. She smoothed her simple grey dress, touched the small silver locket at her throat, and went down the stairs at her own steady pace, neither hurrying toward him nor away. She looked different, though he could not immediately say how. Her dress was simple, plainer than anything she had worn at Harrow House, a soft grey wool, rather than the silks he had once delighted in choosing for her. Yet she wore it with a quiet steadiness that no amount of silk had ever given her. There was colour in her cheeks, despite the hardship he knew she must have endured. A healthy brightness that spoke of honest work rather than idle comfort. And her eyes, when they met his, held none of the desperate hope he had, in some quiet corner of his mind, expected to find there. "Your Grace," she said. The formality of it struck him harder than any accusation could have. 6 weeks earlier, she had called him Alistair in every private moment they shared, had said his name softly against his shoulder in the quiet dark of the gardens. Now she stood before him with the careful, distant politeness of a stranger addressing a customer, and he understood, in that single word, exactly how far he had pushed her away, and how thoroughly. "Evelina," he said, his own voice rougher than he intended, "I have come to tell you that you were right, about everything." He explained it all, the discrepancy Nathaniel had found, the ledger, matching every figure she had once laid before him, Julian's thin excuses collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof, his cousin's departure from London, and from the family entirely, the vow to repay every shilling stolen from the widow's fund. He watched her face as he spoke, searching for some flicker of vindication, of relief, of anything he might build upon, some crack in her composure he could work his way through. She listened quietly, without interrupting, her hands folded neatly before her, and when he finished, she studied him for a long moment before speaking, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "I did not need you to confirm it," she said. "I already knew I was right, Alistair. I knew it the moment I read the ledger with my own eyes, and nothing you have told me today changes what I already understood about the truth of the matter." "Then let me make it right," he said, taking a half step toward her, before catching himself. "Come home. Julian is gone. My mother has been told the truth of what happened, and she will not trouble you again. I have seen to that myself. There is nothing left standing between us." Evelina was quiet for a moment, and Alistair, watching her, felt the first true stirring of fear he had felt since arriving at that narrow, tidy house, a fear far sharper than anything he had felt during his frantic search across the city. He had expected relief. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, something close to gratitude, a swift and grateful return to everything she had left behind. He had not expected the calm, thoughtful sorrow that crossed her face instead. "I did not leave because you made a mistake about Julian," she said finally, her voice gentle but unwavering. "I know men are sometimes wrong, and I would have forgiven a mistake honestly made, even one as costly as this. I left because when you had to choose between the truth and your family's comfort, you did not hesitate, Alistair. You chose your pride, without a moment's true doubt, and you asked me to help you carry that choice quietly, as though my silence were a small favor, rather than a betrayal of everything I believe. And then, when I would not simply agree, you reminded me that I had nowhere else to go, as though my poverty made my conscience a thing you were entitled to control." "I know," Alistair said quietly, the words costing him more than he expected. "I have thought of little else these past weeks. I have replayed that conversation more times than I can count, and each time I understand a little better what it must have cost you to walk away. I do not doubt that you regret it now," Evelina continued, her tone not unkind but entirely unflinching. "But regret after the truth has been forced upon you by a clerk's ledger is not the same as choosing rightly when it mattered most, when only my word stood against your family's comfort. I needed to know, Alistair, what kind of man you were when there was something real at stake, something that could not simply be smoothed over with pretty words. And you showed me plainly, that evening in your study, exactly what kind of man that was." He felt the words land exactly as she intended them to, without cruelty, but without softness either. Simple honesty laid bare the way she had once laid the ledger before him on that same desk weeks ago. He had come expecting to rescue her from hardship, expecting to find a woman worn thin and grateful for his arrival, and found instead that she required no rescue at all. She had built, in 6 short weeks, a life entirely her own, steady and self-sufficient, in a way his wealth and title had never truly been for her. "I do not know how to make you believe I have changed," he said, "beyond simply telling you and hoping the telling is enough." "It is not enough," Evelina answered, though not unkindly. "Nor should it be, Alistair. Words cost a man nothing to speak. I have learned that quite thoroughly these past weeks, listening to closed doors offer their own kind of well-spoken regret, while denying me honest work all the same. What convinced me you had failed me was not a single sentence you spoke in that study. It was a pattern of choices, small and large, made over the whole of our engagement, that I simply had not troubled myself to notice until the largest one forced my eyes open. If I am ever to trust you again, it will not be because of anything you say to me today. It will be because of what you continue to choose, quietly, when no one is watching and nothing forces your hand." Alistair absorbed this in silence for a long moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Then I accept that I have a great deal of proving still ahead of me, and very little right to ask you to wait for it." "I did not say I would not wait," Evelina said, something gentler entering her voice for the first time. I said only that I would not return, simply because you have asked prettily, and meant it sincerely in this particular moment. There is a difference between a man's sincerity today and his character over the whole of a life, and I have already mistaken the one for the other once. What would you have me do? He asked, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice carried none of a duke's certainty, only the quiet uncertainty of a man who had finally understood how much he stood to lose, and how little he had done, thus far, to deserve winning it back. Evelina considered the question carefully before answering, her gaze steady on his. I would have you become the man I once believed you to be, not for my sake, but because it is right, regardless of whether it wins you anything at all. And if, in time, you prove that this change is real, and not merely regret speaking in a moment of fear and loneliness, then perhaps we may speak again of what might be possible between us. And if I prove it? Alistair asked. What then, Evelina? A small, careful smile touched her lips, the first true softness he had seen from her since he arrived, and something in his chest loosened at the sight of it. Then you may ask me again, Alistair. Properly, this time, without an ultimatum standing behind it, without my poverty as leverage in your hand, and I will answer you as a woman who chooses you freely, not as one who has nowhere else to turn and no other choice to make. He left Mrs. Feld's boarding house that evening without the reunion he had hoped for, but not, he found, without hope entirely. He understood now that Evelina's love, if he earned it back, would be worth infinitely more than the easy devotion he had once taken for granted, precisely because she no longer needed him to survive, and would only return to him if she genuinely wished to. In the weeks that followed, Alistair returned, slowly and without demands, learning patience he had never before required of himself. A duke, accustomed to swift decisions and immediate obedience, learning, for the first time, to wait. He funded, quietly and without seeking credit or public thanks, proper support for the widow's charity Julian had betrayed, restoring every shilling that had been stolen, and more besides, working directly with the trust's solicitor to ensure the money reached those it was always meant for. He asked after Evelina's translation work with genuine interest rather than condescension, and when she mentioned in passing during one brief visit a particularly difficult passage of French poetry troubling her, he spent an entire evening at his own desk attempting to translate it himself, more for the pleasure of understanding her world than for any real hope of impressing her. Evelina, for her part, did not rush toward forgiveness, nor did she withhold it out of stubborn pride or a desire to punish him further than the truth already had. She watched him carefully, the way a woman watches a garden she is not yet certain will bloom, noting each small, steady change without allowing herself to trust it entirely too soon, and allowed herself, slowly, to hope again, a hope she guarded as carefully as she had once guarded her few remaining coins. It was several months before she agreed to walk with him through the same gardens at Harrow House, where he had once told her that her honesty felt like a gift rather than a burden. This time, when he took her hand beneath the old oak tree, it was not the hand of a duke claiming what he believed already belonged to him. It was the hand of a man asking, humbly and honestly, for something he understood now he would have to earn every single day, and would gladly spend the rest of his life earning. I chose pride once, he told her, as they walked beneath a canopy of early summer leaves, the same gentle light falling through the branches as it had on the day he first proposed to her. I do not intend to make that choice again, Evelina, not while I draw breath. Whatever it costs me, I will choose the truth, and I will choose you, standing beside it. Evelina looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes, Alistair finally saw what he had been searching for since the day he found her doorway in Bloomsbury. Not the desperate need of a woman with nowhere else to go, but the steady, chosen affection of a woman who had built a life strong enough to walk away from him twice, and had decided, freely and with clear eyes, that she wished to stay instead. Then, she said quietly, perhaps we may begin again, properly this time, with nothing standing between us but the truth. And in that quiet garden, with nothing left to hide and nothing left to bargain with, only the honest ground they had both, at great cost, learned to stand upon, they did begin again, and this time it was built to last. Their eventual wedding, held nearly a year after that first terrible confrontation in his study, was a far quieter affair than the grand celebration originally planned, held in a small parish church rather than the grand cathedral once discussed, at Evelina's own quiet insistence. Rosamond, who had softened considerably in the months between, having been forced by circumstance to reckon honestly with her own part in what had happened, stood witness alongside Beatrice, whom Evelina had insisted upon inviting, and Mrs. Feld, who wept openly through the entire ceremony, despite her usual stern composure. Mr. Wexley sent a fine leather-bound volume of French poetry as a gift, inscribed simply, "For the best translator I have ever employed, with gratitude." Theodore, seated near the back of the small church, remarked afterward to no one in particular that he had never seen his old friend look quite so unguarded, quite so entirely without armor, and considered it, in his own quiet way, the truest sign that the marriage was built on something real. Genevieve, the young seamstress's assistant who had once shared a wall with Evelina in Mrs. Feld's house, sent a small handmade gift through the post, a delicately embroidered handkerchief bearing Evelina's initials, along with a short note thanking her for the bread and company on a hard winter morning that Genevieve confessed she had never forgotten. Evelina kept the handkerchief in her writing desk for years afterward, taking it out now and then when she wished to remember exactly how far a small kindness could travel, and how little it required to matter. Mrs. Feld, ever practical even amid her own tears, insisted afterward that Evelina keep the small key to her old room at the boarding house, in case, she said gruffly, a woman ever needed reminding that she had once built a life entirely on her own, and could do so again if the world ever demanded it of her. Evelina kept that key in a small drawer for the rest of her life, and though she never again had cause to use it, she found comfort simply in knowing it was there. Evelina did not give up her translation work after the marriage, though Alistair never once suggested she should. She continued it quietly from a small study of her own at Harrow House, a room she had chosen herself and furnished plainly, by her own preference, and Alistair often found her there in the evenings, bent over some difficult passage by candlelight, exactly as she had been in that narrow Bloomsbury room, except that now she hummed softly as she worked, unburdened by hunger or fear. He never forgot the 6 weeks she had spent surviving without him, nor did he ever again make the mistake of believing comfort could substitute for honesty in a marriage. Whenever a difficult truth arose in the years that followed, and difficult truths, being a natural part of any long life together, arose more than once, Alistair thought of the ledger and of the woman who had laid it before him with steady hands, and chose, every time, to face the truth beside her, rather than to hide from it alone. There came a season, some years into the marriage, when a distant relation of Alistair's arrived at Harrow House with a scheme involving borrowed money and a misrepresented investment, hoping to trade on the family name to secure funds he had little real intention of repaying. The old Alistair might have hesitated, weighing the discomfort of confrontation against the ease of quiet accommodation. This Alistair did not hesitate at all. He refused plainly, in front of his mother and his wife both, and afterward, walking with Evelina in the same gardens where he had once asked her to overlook Julian's theft, he found himself grateful, in a way he had not expected, that the choice had cost him so little difficulty this time. "You did not even pause," Evelina observed, something like quiet wonder in her voice. "I have had a great deal of practice choosing differently since the last time," Alistair said. "It grows easier, Evelina, the more often a man makes the harder choice instead of the comfortable one. I only wish I had learned that lesson before it cost me you, even temporarily." "You did not lose me," Evelina said gently. "You only misplaced yourself for a time. I am glad, every day, that you found your way back to the man I always believed you capable of being." That, in the end, was the quiet inheritance Evelina had given him, worth far more than any title or fortune he had once believed he was offering her. She had taught him, at great cost to herself, that love without honesty was only ever a comfortable kind of loneliness, and that the harder, truer thing, two people choosing each other freely, with clear eyes and nothing hidden between them, was worth every bit of the difficulty it demanded. Years later, when their own daughter was old enough to understand such stories, Evelina told her, simply and without embellishment, about a ledger she had once found behind a stack of linens, and a duke who had asked her to look away from it, and a single trunk she had carried out into an uncertain London evening, rather than agree. She did not tell it as a tale of triumph over a villain, for Alistair had never truly been a villain, only a man who had once let pride guide him where honesty should have. She told it, instead, as a simple lesson, the same one her own father had once given her at a small kitchen table by candlelight. That dignity, however costly to keep, was worth infinitely more than any comfort bought at its expense, and that the truest kind of love was never the kind that asked a person to become smaller in order to be kept. In the quiet years that followed, whenever Evelina passed the milliner's shop she had once lingered outside during her hardest weeks, she found herself smiling rather than aching, remembering the woman who had stood there with an empty purse and a full heart, refusing to let either poverty or love talk her out of what she knew to be right. That woman, she understood now, had never truly needed rescuing at all. She had only needed the chance to prove it, and the courage to seize that chance when it came. One honest coin, one honest word, and one honest choice at a time.